Hey there, and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel for a new video, and this time I guess we'll do something very interesting, because what we're gonna do today is implement authentication in a Blazor WebAssembly application, and we'll do this with the help of Azure Active Directory. So in summary, what we'll do today is just simply, okay, how can we authenticate users in a Blazor WebAssembly application? And it's really important to underline Blazor WebAssembly because when we talk about authentication, we have two different concepts or ways to handle authentication if we are in a Blazor WebAssembly app or if we are in a Blazor server app. Because Blazor WebAssembly is essentially a single page application framework, just like Angular for instance, and therefore the way that we handle authentication is really different. But before we get really going, I just want to show you exactly what we will do today. And if you watch the previous videos on this channel, we have a video on implementing basic CRUD operations with Blazor WebAssembly, where we have set up also a database and we do real API calls in order to get the data that we need into our application. So what we're gonna do today is actually we'll start from there, and I really want to set up the scene here because this is really important, I guess, to understand exactly the goal that we want to achieve in this video. So let's run the application, and this is the application that we have right now. So we have still this fetch data nav menu, but in this case it's really loading the data from a database. And if you didn't watch the previous video about Blazor or about basic CRUD operations with Blazor WebAssembly, I will leave the link to that video in the description of this one, so you can go there and check it out. And even we also have published this application to a repository on GitHub, and you will find also the link to the repository also in the description of this video. So coming back to this application, the goal that we have for today is actually to implement something like a button or anything here in this upper part of the menu where we have the option to log in. And if we are logged in, of course, we should display, for instance, I don't know, the username that is currently logged in or something like that. And then we should also have a logout button, for instance. And last but not least, the most important thing is to check then how can we actually make sure that our Blazor components, for instance, this weather forecast component, is only accessible for authenticated users. So this is what we want to do today. At the end of this video, we should have here, for instance, if we are on the home page and we try to navigate to the fetch data and we are not authenticated, then we should either be redirected to the login, or we should get a message that, hey, you should be authenticated for this, so please go on and log in if you really want to do that. So this is the goal. Now let's get started. I said that what we want to do is achieve the authentication using Azure Active Directory. And here before we start writing code and doing things, I think this is really important, and I want to stress this out. Since Blazor WebAssembly is essentially a single page application framework, what we have to do is actually to implement one of the, I would call them, standard authentication mechanisms that we have at our disposals. And when we talk about single page applications and authentication, there is OpenID Connect. So anytime that we actually want to do authentication in a Blazor WebAssembly app, what we need to do is actually to implement this OpenID Connect flow or OIDC flow. Now, the good news is that we have some libraries that Microsoft created that we can use, so we don't have to really take care about really all the implementations of the OIDC. But we need actually to know the basics about what is an OpenID Connect flow and how things should work. I won't concentrate in this video on the technical part on how to really implement this OpenID Connect flow, but instead what we'll do, we'll actually use the Blazor libraries that we have and that actually help us a lot in configuring all the, I would say, OIDC specific stuff, but it still allows us to have an overview about the entire authentication mechanism in our application. So before we get going, once again, In summary, what we want to do is implement authentication in a Blazor WebAssembly application with Azure Active Directory, and of course using OIDC or OpenID Connect. So let's get started to do that. What we need to do here is, since we want to implement authentication with Azure Active Directory, the first thing that we need to do, of course, is actually register the application that we want to authenticate in our Azure Active Directory. So I'm logged in here on my Azure subscription, so I will go on Azure Active Directory, and here it takes just a few seconds to load. And here, let me just make this a little bit bigger. Here we have, for instance, here we have a list of our enterprise applications, but what we really need here is to go here on this app registration blade. And here you'll see a bunch of applications that I have already registered with my Azure Active Directory. So let's go on and register a new one. So what we have to do is, first we have to give a name to this application, and let's call this weather forecast. That would be the name. And here what we want to do is choose how do we actually want our authentication to work. And I would say we have here two very important options. First of one is this single tenant option, when we log in or when we authenticate users coming only from one specific Azure Active Directory. And we have the second option, which is multi-tenant, and in this case our application would be allowed to log in or to authenticate users that belong maybe to different Azure Active Directories. Now we will go here with the first option, and the primary reason why we do that is that I don't know, I guess starting with June, in order, if you want to register an application and if you want to go for this multi-tenant flow, you actually have to or need to have a registered domain and a verified account in order to be able to do that. So I don't have this right now because this is only a demo, a tenant or a demo subscription that I have here on Azure. So that's why we will go with this first option. But if you can set up authentication for multi-tenant apps, if you have a domain that is already registered to Azure Active Directory, and if you have verified it, then you should be able to actually also choose this, and it should work exactly the same way. So no big difference, except maybe for the authority that we would need to use. But I will show you that just a little bit later. So right now I just wanted to explain why actually we choose this option. And the outcome is that we will be able to only authenticate users coming from this Azure Active Directory. And then there is another thing that we have to provide here. It is this redirect URL. And here, this redirect URL is actually something that's very, very important. Let me just run the application again, because I'm not sure about the port that we actually have right now. And I want to make sure that it is the correct one. So we have here 44. Okay, it's a little bit different to what I have here. So let me go here once again, and let's change the port number. Very, very quick, and that should be it. Now, what we will do here is we will provide this URL as a callback, and as a part of the OIDC flow, how this is actually supposed to work, and maybe that's something that would be nice to explain. But let me just first paste here this callback, and we'll click here on register, and then this will be saved. We'll still have to do some settings here, but we'll look into those settings just in a moment. But right now I wanted to just explain how this is supposed to work. So when you go to our Blazor WebAssembly application, you are initially, let's say, not logged in at all. So what happens is that at a certain point you, click on a link or on a button, whatever we have in our application, and then this entire authentication flow, this entire OIDC flow will get started. And in this flow, what will happen is that we will actually be redirected to the identity provider. In this case, the identity provider is, of course, Azure Active Directory, because we have registered our application in Azure Active Directory. So what it will happen when we click on login in our application, is that as a first step, we will be redirected to Azure Active Directory for authentication. In reality, we'll see we'll have a pop-up. It will not be a real redirect, but that's really not important. Of course, when we arrive there, we have to authenticate ourselves. So provide username, password, provide a two-factor authentication code if we have that set up on our Azure Active Directory and things like that. And once we are authenticated, or we have proved to Azure Active Directory that we are really the persons that have all the rights to log in with that account, so when Azure Active Directory is able to authenticate us, it will actually redirect the user back to our application, and it will use this callback URL in order to do that we have set up earlier. And if you take a look very quick here on this notepad that we have right here, so actually we'll see a little bit later that this is, I would say, a setup that we'll create. So we'll have a route, we'll make sure that we'll have a route that is called authentication and login callback. And we will have probably authentication login, we'll have logout and other things like that. But we'll see how we'll implement them just in a second. Let's go back now to our Azure Active Directory, because there are a few things that we still have to set up. So first, we should go here on this authentication blade. Now on this authentication blade, here actually I just noticed that I registered the application the wrong way. So let me go here back and let's just delete this. Sorry for that. Let's just delete this and we'll create a new application registration. Let's call this weather forecast again. Here we leave this option, but then there is one other thing that we need, and here we have to specify that we are in a scenario for a single page application, because that's essentially Blazor WebAssembly. So we could have changed this also from the authentication blade, but just for your reference, so that you know how to do it the right way, I just wanted to redo this entire registration and show you that you actually have to choose this single page app option that we have here in this drop down. So let's click here on register once again, and then we'll go on this authentication tab. Then we see that we have this callback URL that we have provided. We see that we are in a single page application scenario. But then there is one other thing that we want to do. We have to check here that, okay, we want an ID token. And this is essentially a part of the OIDC specification, because what happens is that when Azure Active Directory will redirect the user to our app, it will also provide the identity token for the specific user. So that would be essentially a JOT token that will contain information about the user that just authenticated to our application. And this is some very, very important stuff, and we'll do some other videos especially on how to handle different type of tokens that we could have in Blazor WebAssembly, and how can we actually use them, or how can we actually use information from the tokens throughout our application. But this is really out of scope for this specific video. So once again, it's important here that what we will receive here just for the authentication part, so nothing else, just to be able to authenticate user, we want to receive an ID token back when we get the callback from Azure Active Directory. So this is the first thing that we have to do here. Everything else can or should actually remain the same, I guess. Let's click here very, very quick on save. And then there is one other important step that we would have to do, and for that we would have to go here on this API API permissions blade. And here we have that we already have this user.read permission on the Microsoft Graph. It could be that this permission is actually sufficient, but in order to be precise, what we actually want to do right now is to authenticate user. And for that, we have a very specific permission on the Microsoft Graph API. And let's choose the Microsoft Graph API, and let's choose here delegated permissions. And here we see that we have these OpenID permissions. So these are permissions that are specific to this OpenID Connect flow. And what we would need from here is, of course, we want to sign in users. And let's maybe also check that we want to see the user's basic profile. And let's click on add permissions. And these permissions are actually very, very important because what happens is that when you will get for the first time the redirection to Azure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory will exactly tell you, hey, these are the permissions that this app needs from you. And you have to give your consent to that. So this is a part of this flow, and it really needs to be transparent. And this is why it's important that you'll always add all the permissions or the needed permissions for the application here, so that the user can exactly check or know what type of information will your application read from Azure Active Directory. And since we are here, what we'll also do, we'll go here on OpenID and we'll open that. And we see here that we can copy here this to clipboard. This is actually a URI that identifies the scope within Azure Active Directory, and we'll probably need that later. And then, sorry, I didn't want to save that. And before we really leave this Azure portal, we go back to this overview tab, and there are two other important informations that we need. First of all, we need the directory or the tenant ID. Let's copy this to clipboard and let's copy it here. But I guess I'll move this to the other screen because I really don't want these IDs to remain visible for too long. So I copied then then we need also the client ID, sorry. So let's copy this client ID to clipboard to our notepad, and then we should be able, or we should good to go. But it's important to get those type of information because you would have to provide them in order to be able to get things working according to what we do here in this video. So yeah, that's it, I guess, from the part where we have to register the application in the Azure portal. And believe me, this is a very, very important part. So it would be nice if you could pay a great attention to what we did, because it's really, really important. And it's actually similar if you want to add some other type of applications maybe later. You can do that because it's essentially the same thinking process behind that. So let's go now back to Visual Studio, I guess, where we have this application that we have created earlier. As I said, we have even a video on that. And what we'll concentrate today, since we want to implement authentication in Blazor WebAssembly, the only project that we will all actually work on today or in this video is actually this one, this Blazor CRUD client, because we want to implement this in our client, not on our server where we have the API. Okay, so the first thing that we actually need to do here is install a package. And if we go here, manage NuGet packages. Sorry. We have this, if we go on browse, I have here, no, I don't want that one. So we need to search for a package. It's called Microsoft Authentication, WebAssembly, and MSAL. This is from Microsoft Authentication Library. It's actually the authentication library that we need in order to connect or to work with the Microsoft Identity Platform or Azure Active Directory v2. It's exactly what we did, or where we did register the application earlier. What I will do, however, I will install the 5.0.1 version because I have tested this out with the 5.0.1 version, and I don't want to have surprises on things that maybe work just a little bit different in the 5.0.2. So I would install this 5.0.1. We would have to accept everything that we have here, and in just a few seconds we should be able, or we should actually be good to go with that. If we go here on installed, we see that we have really installed that. So that is actually very, very cool. Now, there is one other thing that we will need to do here is we need to go here in this imports.razor, And here is essentially a part, or the part of a Blazor WebAssembly app, where we actually import all the libraries actually that we will need in our Blazor components. And in order to avoid having usings for this type of libraries in each component, we can actually do this centrally here. So I would go here just below system.net.htp.json, and I will add this using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components authorization. So this is actually one important stuff, one important thing that we would have to pay attention to. Now, the next thing that we will need to do here, of course, is that we need to provide the settings, or the Azure Active Directory settings for this application, and for the Microsoft Authentication library that we'll use in order to perform the steps, or to go through all the flow that we have in, or that is defined in the OIDC standard. So what we'll do here is we'll go to this www root folder, and here we'll add a new file, and let's click on new item. And what we'll want to do here is go in, I would say ASP.NET Core. Let's go here on web. Let's go on scripts, because what we actually want here is a JSON file. Do we have a JSON file here? TypeScript, JavaScript JSON configuration file. Yeah, this is actually what we would need. And let's call this appsettings.json. But let's not appsettings.json should be okay, I guess. And just to make sure that we won't have any surprises, I will right click that file, I will go on properties, and here on copy to output, I will set this to copy always, because we want to make sure that this file is copied over when we build the application and when it is actually shipped to the browser. And let's go and click on save all, and we can then just close these properties here. Good. So what we'll do here is we'll actually delete what we have here, and we'll replace that with the following information. And I already have it ready. So we create an object. The authority is essentially this URL for loginmicrosoft.com, and then the tenant ID that we copied earlier from our Azure portal. And then the client ID, of course, is the client ID that we copied over, and I have to update this client, of course. And let's just do that. So that should be it. And this validated authority is set to true. This is an option that actually the library needs in order to create the authentication configuration for this entire OIDC flow. And then, this being said, this is everything that we need for this configuration. Then the next step is, of course, we should go here to program.cs, and well, we need to add the authentication service, which is part of this Microsoft Authentication WebAssembly MSAL library. So in order to do that, we'll simply go for builder.services, and then we have add MSAL authorization, or sorry, MSAL authentication. That should be it. But of course, we need to configure or to provide some options to that. So it accepts actually an options object, but this options object will contain a lot of information, or well, it could contain a lot of information. In our case, there won't be that much information, but there are a few things that we need to do. And first of them is, of course, we have to configure the application to read the information or read the Azure AD options that we have in the appsettings.json file, and of course use that information in order to perform the entire OIDC authentication. And this is why we have to provide that, and we can simply go for the builder, then configuration, and here on this configuration we can say bind. We can say bind this configuration from the section that is called Azure AD actually, and bind that to options provider options. It is not options. We call this OPT for options, provider options. Okay, and then of course authentication, because this is actually what we want to do, and this is a first thing that we have to do. And then there is another thing that I really I guess it's not even in the official documentation, but it seems that when I worked with this and when I tested it, if you try to do or if you try to perform an authentication using just this type of configuration, it will throw you an error that you are missing some scopes. So what we will do here is then we will add a default scope, and this is options. Okay, it's not options, it's OPT, sorry for that. OPT.provider options, and here we should have something like, I guess, default access token scopes. And here what we can do here, we can add of course to that. And here we have just to provide a string for the scope that we want to have as default. And if you remembered, we copied this from the Azure AD portal. So I will just go over and copy it right here. And this is the OpenID scope that we need once again in order to be able to authenticate users. So yeah, this being said, right now we have added the authentication service to our app. And then before we really start going into our Blazor components and create the components that we need for authentication and modify the fetch data component to actually require authentication, there is one other important thing that we need to do. So the fact is that basically what happens is that when you install this Microsoft Authentication WebAssembly MSAL library, it actually comes also with a JavaScript file that is called authentication service.js, because all the logic actually for implementing this authentication flow, this OpenID flow, is actually in that JavaScript file. And probably the reason why Microsoft does this in a JavaScript file is that, that library actually can be used in several other type of apps that rely only on JavaScript. And it really wouldn't make sense to create a brand new library for that in C# if they already had one. So we just need actually to also load that JavaScript file into our Blazor WebAssembly app. So in order to do that, we should go to this index.html part. And you see that here in this index.html, we already have a JavaScript file that is added. So we'll just add a new script tag, and I just paste it, and the source. So when you install Razor class libraries, and I guess that's something that we'll cover in a total separate video, you can of course also include in those libraries static content like CSS files, JavaScript files, HTML files, things like that. So what happens that when the application gets built, what happens is that all those static files that come actually from the libraries or from the Razor class libraries that you installed via NuGet, they will actually always be placed in this content, then the name of the library, which is Microsoft Authentication WebAssembly MSAL, and then we can specify the name of the file that we actually need. And in this case, we need this JavaScript file. So this is why we actually need to do that. And now everything should theoretically be wired up correctly. Now, right now we don't really have a way to really test that, but we can do that in a second, I would guess. And right now we actually will start to create some new components. So we will go here into this shared folder, and the first component that we will create is a Razor component, and let's call this login display, and this razor.cs, no, without cs, sorry. And this component, what it will actually do is actually it will provide that login button and things similar to that. And in order to not lose more time on this, I will just copy over, because as said, I have already tested this out. So not to waste a lot of time, here is our login display component. So just briefly, let me explain what we have here. So first of all, we have this authorized view component. So actually our visual elements here are placed in this authorized view component, and we'll come to this back just a little bit later when we'll implement, let's say, in our fetch data component, this concept of displaying that data only if the user is authenticated. But if the user is authorized, in this case, if the user is authenticated, what we'll actually do here is we'll read the user's name. And here there is one important thing that I would like to dwell on just for a while. So we see that we have this context which is of type authentication state, and this is really important because it's specific for Blazor. We have this also in Blazor server, but here actually in Blazor WebAssembly this is totally important, and I will tell you exactly why. So if you are I would say accustomed to develop regular ASP.NET applications, you know that basically all the applications heavily rely on this concept of having an HTTP request that comes in, and of course a response that is generated to that request. So what happens is that whenever a request comes in, you can inject, or you can get access if you want, to a class that is called, or that is of type HTTP context. And in the HTTP context, you have a lot of information about that specific HTTP request, including information about the authenticated user. So if the user or if the user that made the request was authenticated, then you'll have in the HTTP context some information about that specific user. Now in Blazor WebAssembly, of course, we don't work with the HTTP context at all because we don't handle HTTP requests. So this is why in Blazor we have actually this authentication state provider class that will that is injected actually when that you already have at your disposal, I would say, in your Blazor apps, and you can simply use that in order to read, for instance, in this case, the name of the user that is currently logged in. And this is a very, very important thing. And of course, if the user is not logged, in, then we have this this very simple href that redirects to login, and we will implement the login page just in a while. And here we just have this begin logout. So if the user wants to log out, the user clicks on that button, and what we do here is that we have this sign out manager, and we inject this actually here, sign out session state manager. So this is actually the service that you would have to inject in order to sign out users. And actually the authentication library behind the hood uses exactly the same I would say concept. Of course, it doesn't use the sign out session state manager, but there are some classics specific for the sign in for that. But it's actually all of them are in a way or the other part of this entire authentication mechanisms that we have in Blazor. So we just inject this sign out session state manager, and we use this sign out session state manager to just set sign out state, and this actually will trigger the start of the sign out. And the JavaScript file that implements the OpenID connect flow will actually then take it from there and perform the sign out according to the OpenID specification. And then we just and what we do then is we just navigate to another component which is actually called logout. So this is actually what we need to do. Now there is another component that we would need to create, and we'll see exactly how we will use that. and we'll create it also in this shared folder. So let's click here Blazor component once again, and we'll call this redirect to login. Redirect to login. So it seems to be correct. And once again, for this one, I will just copy over some markup and code behind. This is actually a very easy one because it's actually a component that doesn't have a view. So you don't have any visual elements on this component. And this is also something very interesting because you can have components in Blazor that don't necessarily have also visual elements. And what actually is the purpose of this component? Well, of course, we'll actually use it just to navigate, to login when we need to do that. And here we just get the string where we are currently, and then we just go to login, and then we also set a query param to specify which should be the return URL after the login occurs. So this is essentially what we actually do here. And then there is one other very small component that we would have to create, but we'll create that in this pages tab. And here let's add once again a Blazor component, and let's call this component let's call this authentication.Blazor. Okay, let me just delete this very quick. And this is actually the component that would also be routable, and we'll see exactly it will also contain the actions that we will want to have. So that would be login, logout, callback. But how we implement that is we use a route param. We say that, okay, this page is always displayed when we go to this type of URL. Let's say it's authentication and / and then we have a placeholder for an action. So this means that whenever we navigate to somewhere, whatever comes after this / is actually taken as an incoming parameter and is actually set here. And this is actually important because we have here this remote authenticator view, which is essentially a component from Microsoft Authentication .webassembly.msal, and this is the component itself, the Blazor component itself, that handles everything that is related actually to this whole OpenID Connect standard. So this is how we implement this using this remote authenticator view. Of course, we could create different components for login, for logout, for callback, but since we actually since all those components are essentially coming actually from the same parent, we can just simply use this and just use this param, and instead of having 3 components, we just have only one, which is always better because it's easier to understand what actually happens here. Good. And now actually we should be ready with all the things that we need for authentication. And now the only thing, or just a few things that we still have to do is, of course, we need to go to this app.Blazor. Where is it? Here it is. Now in this app.Blazor is actually where the routing is specified and where we specify how the routing works, which assemblies should be considered for routing, and things similar to that. And what we would have to do here, and believe me, this is really important, is actually, well, of course, we need to somehow actually state that, hey, in all of our routing, whatever, we need that the application also takes into consideration that we want to use authentication. And to do that, we have actually a cascading parameter, and this is here, it's called cascading authentication state. Let's close this. And essentially what we would have to do is that this entire router stuff actually should go there in this cascading authentication. And this will cascade authentication to actually all of the routes that we have in this application. Now, what we can do here is in this found content, So we have this one here. What we could do here we have this router view, route data, and where the route should be looked at. But what we could actually here, what we could actually do here is we say that for not authorized. Okay, but I'm not sure. Sorry, there's something else that we will need to do here. It is we need this authorized route view. Sorry for that. We need this authorized route view component, and in this authorized route view component, well, what we could do is actually we could actually move this entire route view in this authorized part. So let's just do that. So here we could just what we need here, I guess with copy paste will not work that easy. So it would be route data, and this would be equal to route data. And there is one other thing that we want to do here is we want to specify the default layout. So we'll have default layout, and sorry, this would be type of and main layout, because that is, of course, we have to type this correctly, main layout, and that should be it. And here, what we could do here is then we can say, for instance, that if it is not, if the access to this view is not authorized, we have this component, this not authorized component. And what we see here is we check that context. Once again, that is the authentication state provider that provides us with information about the authenticated users. And if the user is not signed in, or actually if this is authenticated property is actually false, then what we'll show is actually we will do this redirect login. So we'll actually go or show this component, which will actually do this redirect to the login part. And this is what we actually need to do. Now, if it's not found, we can leave things like that. I guess it's really important. However, once again, the very important stuff here is we need this cascading authentication state, and this cascades authentication information to the entire router component that we have here. And inside this router component, what we can do here is we can use an authorized view, and then basically in that view we show the route data, or the components actually that will come back actually from this routing process, and we'll use here this default layout. And if the user is not authenticated, we just will redirect to login, and this will happen actually as the routing occurs. Now there is one other thing I guess that we would need to do here is that in the main layout part. And in this main layout, where is that? Actually, what we need to do here, that's actually very easy, is here in this box, what we'll do, we just provide the login display component. It's important because in this component we have the button for login, for logout, and the entire logic for signing out, which is very important because this will actually display the button on our application. And let's rebuild the application, because that's at least at this point we should be able to check if authentication really works as expected. So let's wait just a few seconds that we do a rebuild. Okay, we have here this warning. I just so let me run this once again and see what happens. So okay, we are redirected to our page, which is cool. Okay, and here it's authorizing, and here we have an exception. So let's just close that, and let's just check what type of exception did we have here. It should be on output. Let me just briefly go through this and see exactly what we have. Microsoft WebAssembly diagnostics, okay. Response, something didn't went well there. Debug, this is actually what we need. So what error do we have? Authentication state service init was undefined, so it's actually a problem with JavaScript. So we just have to look into what the problem is right now. So what I think is simply a problem that maybe things didn't really get shipped correctly to the browser. So I would just like to do a clean solution before that, because I guess some things are not shipped correctly. So let's just try once again right now after we did clean this solution, and hopefully this would work right now. If not, we will have to look actually in the network to see if the authentication service.js file gets served, if the app settings.json file gets served, and things like that. So right now it works. So we see that, hey, we have this hello world, we have this login here. So let's see if that actually really works. Here, you see that we're checking login state. This comes actually from this remote authorization view. And here, of course, we need to sign in. And I'll use my Azure AD account that I have here. Hopefully I typed it correctly. And I have a password for that. Hopefully it's the correct one. No, of course. Let me try again. It should be this one. Come on. Okay. Maybe your account password are incorrect. Don't remember your password. You know what? Let's reset it now. But I was fairly sure that. Oh, it's come with this captcha thing. I really hate that. So let's try again. I'm not sure. I hope that I'm using my correct account that I have in that Azure Active Directory. Oh, it's still not correct. Just give me just a second. Sorry for that. Let me. I will go back to my Azure Active Directory right now. Just give me a few seconds for that. Because I just want to check here all my users, and maybe I'll reset the password for that one. Okay, and this should be this one, but I don't want you to see this entire process, so this is why I'm actually hiding this right now, because, well, there are some information about that user that, of course, I don't want to be public. But what I'm doing here, I'm using the Azure portal and the administration features that it offers us, and there is a reset password, and it will generate actually a password that I would have to change on the login, but then I can actually use this password right now. It was generated automatically by Azure, so that should actually do it. Of course, I will have to change right now my password again, probably, and I also need to get the multi-factor authentication code, and hopefully it doesn't really take too long for it to arrive. And I guess it should be there already, and it should be, I guess it's still not here. Okay, now it arrived. It's this one, 408, and it should be okay. So let's verify that. And here, of course, okay, current password. Then let's create a new one, and let's click here, sign in. Okay, and you see that here, when I arrived to this, sorry, you can't see my screen right now. Let me change. So essentially what I did reset my password, and once I did that, you see that this pop-up actually informs me about some very, very important things. First of all, it gives it shows me the name of the app that currently wants to authenticate me, And then it says that this application is not published by Microsoft, of course, because it's an application that we have created. And it says here, okay, this these are the permissions that actually these applications would like from you. Is this view your basic profile and maintain access to data you have given it access to. This would essentially mean it can actually sign you in and sign you out. So I have to consent this and to accept that. And I have to do this only once, of course, for each app. And then you see that I am logged in. And it works because right now this login display just displays here my display name, and I have here this logout button. So this thing works right now. We have implemented authentication with Azure Active Directory. So what we should do next is, of course, let me just log out first. Of course, I will be redirected. I would log out from that account, and I am redirected here to the logout callback. And here it says you are logged out. So even if I'm not logged in, I can still have access to this type of stuff. And what we said earlier is that what we actually want to achieve right now is that we actually want to make this available only for authenticated users. So let's stop this application right now and take a look into how we should actually do that. And it is very, very easy to do actually. So the only thing that we would have to do is, of course, we need to go to the fetch data component, because this is where we want to implement this. And as said, once we have this entire authentication mechanism implemented, giving access to certain components only to authenticated users is totally trivial, easy in Blazor. In fact, the only thing that you would have to do is simply use this authorize view component that we have in Blazor, and this will actually check the entire authentication state that we have in the app for that specific user. And here we have two subcomponents. First of all, for the case that we are authorized, so that we are authenticated, and then we have for not authorized. So it's easy as that. You just have to use this authorized view component. Then in authorized, specify what user should see. In not authorized, you can then specify what the user should see if the user is not authorized. So in our case, of course, if the user is authorized, we want to actually show this entire stuff here. So this means that we will take everything, so the entire part, but we'll have also to include this if, because that's important. So it actually ends here. So we will gonna Control X everything here, but sorry, we should also include that header. So let's do this from scratch. We should even include this one. So all this stuff that we had previously on the page should only be displayed if the user is authorized. So we put everything then inside this authorized part. And then of course, what we want to do here is in the not authorized, we can just simply maybe say display a simple message: you are not authorized to do this. Please log in to access Twitter broadcast. And this is what we want to display if the user is not authorized. And I said that's easy, so it's nothing too complicated. So right now, if we run the application again, at first we shouldn't be authenticated, of course. And then if we go on this fetch data, I would expect that I should see that text that I am not authorized to access that specific data. And in fact, it is exactly that one. So you are not authorized to view this. I have to log in to do that. So if I go to log in, let me just log in again. So it would be this user, and hopefully this time I remember my password. It should be this one, I guess. Oh my god. Do I really always do typos? Am I really using the correct user? Sorry for that one. It should be this one. It should be this one, so it should be correct. Let me try again. Sorry for all this stuff. Let me. No, something is wrong here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so right now my password is correct, and here stay signed in. I would say yes. So right now, as you can see, I was logged in, and if I go right now to fetch data is displayed. So previously, you know that we couldn't or we could see this data even if we are not authenticated. But as we did that change right now, as you see, if you go here, let's go maybe on logout, just to show it again. It will go through this entire logout process. It will redirect me to my application just in a second. And right now, if I go and fetch data, I just see that I am not authorized to do that. So instead, if I go to login again, this time I guess it should be authenticated because, okay, here we go again with the same fun with our password, but in this case, it was the correct one. So I just have to wait once again for the message to arrive, but I guess it's really not important to do that because we have already seen that it actually works. So we can actually close that. So once again, as a summary, once we have implemented the entire authentication stuff with Azure Active Directory in our Blazor WebAssembly app, when we want actually to make sure that we can have access to certain components only if we are authenticated, then we have to place actually those components inside an authorized view. And inside this authorized view, we can have subviews, I would say, for the content that we want to display if the view is authorized, and what we want to display if it is not authorized. And here, for instance, what we could do is, even instead of displaying this text, we can just use our redirect login component, and we will actually kick in the login process for the user just in that specific moment when the user navigates to a certain area of the app, in our case to this fetch data component, that we kick in already this entire OpenID Connect flow. So guys, thank you very much for watching. I know that this has been a very long video, but I think that this topic is very important, and I'm actually quite happy with what we managed to do today or in this video, because we essentially took an application that had no authentication to it at all. It was a Blazor WebAssembly application, and we have implemented authentication in this Blazor WebAssembly application with Azure Active Directory, and of course following this OpenID Connect standard by implementing the Microsoft Authentication WebAssembly.msal library. Yeah, that was actually it. From now on, we have an application that uses authentication and shows certain parts of the application only for the authenticated users. So this being said, thank you very much for watching. If you found this content useful to you, then just don't be shy and share this with your friends, with your peers, through your social network, email, WhatsApp, text messages, whatever you want, but just share that if you think that it might be also valuable for others. And of course, if you didn't subscribe to this channel so far, please do that. It would be really highly appreciated, so you would also keep track or would be notified whenever actually we post some new content, and we try to really do this fairly often, at least twice a week. So once again, just subscribe. And if you have questions, if you have some feedback, if you just want to say something, or if you have better ideas, if you didn't understand something from this video, just don't be shy, use the comments. We are here on YouTube, we have a nice community, and I'm always happy to take the discussions. And yeah, maybe new ideas come from those discussions, and my hunch is that discussions around this type of topics are always useful for all the involved ones, and of course for all viewers that will actually read the comments afterwards. So in summary, just don't be shy and use the comments and get in touch with me. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.